On Meaning of Life TV. I am joined by Thomas Joyner. My name is Josh Summers. This is Meaning of Life TV. And you are Thomas Joyner, Professor of Psychology at Florida State University, where you direct the Laboratory for the Study and Prevention of Suicide-Related Conditions and Behaviors. You've also recently authored a book which caught our attention called Mindlessness, The Corruption of Mindfulness in a Culture of Narcissism. So today we're going to be speaking about mindfulness, mindlessness, narcissism, and the problems therein. And before going further, I just want to say for the people in the video audience that unfortunately this call is going to be recorded with audio only. So you'll just have to sort of listen patiently to this one. But maybe to start out, Thomas, I'm someone who works in the mindfulness and yoga world, and for a long time I've been concerned by issues that you raise in your book. In particular, I've been concerned about how the culture in these worlds tends to be quite self-regarding, quite self-absorbed. There tends to be a heightened focus on the self. And this concern was articulated about 15 years ago in a book by the author Ken Wilber, who wrote a novel called Boomeritis, where he described sort of the toxic brew of what comes in when you have factors of sort of postmodern relativism with narcissism and a culture that's averse to any kind of hierarchy, and how this can really hijack the central intentions of these rugged spiritual practices and lead towards more pathological presentations of sort of narcissistic self-regard. So when I saw your title, I was very excited to talk to you because nothing in my mind, or nothing to my ear, has been said about this in a long time. It's been nearly 15 years since I've seen a title like this come forward. So thank you for bringing this up. Maybe the first question I just start with is your professional expertise seems to be in suicide studies and suicide prevention. What led you to want to write a book on mindfulness itself?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Josh. And it's a little bit of a circuitous path. I mean, as you mentioned, my professional emphasis is on suicide prevention, and then that pulls me towards, wanting to be conversant and up to date on mental health treatments, including, not limited to suicidal behavior, but certainly including it. And so it's through that conduit that I started to become aware of the popularity of mindfulness, because there are psychotherapies that incorporate a lot of mindfulness principles into them. And, at first that seemed reasonable to me. I think there's actually something to those psychotherapies and to the idea, the down-to-earth, original, concrete idea of mindfulness. But as I started to pay a little more attention to it, another trend started to emerge or at least pop out to me. And it's one you alluded to, which is the mixture of things like self-regard, narcissism, and the like with mindfulness, which I think distorts it grotesquely and also is very paradoxical and ironic, because these movements, these practices, at least as I understand them, when done genuinely and as originally intended, have nothing at all to do with selfishness, quite the contrary. So it was that tension and that distortion process that really, it started to get stuck in my craw, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And, to my way of thinking, there aren't many better reasons to write a book than to get something like that off your chest. And so that's essentially what I was doing in this book, is getting that off my chest.
Got it. In the initial section I think in the introduction, actually, you give two analogies that kind of speak to what you fear going on with the mindfulness movement. One is the analogy of cuckoo birds who lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and then when those the babies hatch, they proceed to either push out the host eggs or compete for food with the host eggs. And you kind of compare this fake mindfulness or false mindfulness to that cuckoo bird laying its eggs in the real nest of mindfulness, causing problems there. And that's a fairly in some ways benign analogy, but there's another analogy you gave, which was far more chilling, where you compare what's going on with mindfulness to the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. And I just wanted to see if maybe you could refresh the memory of folks, or for people that maybe weren't even alive at the time that occurred in 1986, what went on with the Challenger explosion, and what is analogous in that you see with the mindfulness movement?
Sure. Well, with regard to the Challenger, I'm a huge space fan. I'm of an age where I was a 4-year-old little boy, and I can remember seeing on TV Neil Armstrong step onto the moon. I've been hooked ever since, and so have been, a fan. Have followed NASA professionally, got to professionally consult with them over the last several years, which has been a thrill. But with regard to Challenger, it was a magisterial achievement, just a gorgeous and beautiful and incredibly complicated machine, which tragically had a very minor, at first seemingly minor, chink in its armor. It had to do with what was called an O-ring, and those are rubbery, sort of valve-like things. And it was very cold that morning, January 28th of 1986, as memory serves, and unusually cold. This is Florida, and so it's usually not that cold, but that morning it was well below freezing. O-rings froze. That, in turn, led to a sequence of events which exploded the Challenger in midair about a minute after it took off. And the analogy that I think is that there, just as there were many admirable things, there still are many admirable things about NASA and all of the activities it undertakes. Many admirable things. There are also admirable things about the original selfless version of mindfulness. But just as the Challenger had a chink in its armor, in my book I argue that original mindfulness has a chink in its armor, and it has to do with its affinity or openness to letting in these distorting influences, these perverting influences even, having to do with narcissism and selfishness and self-regard.
Right. So that may be a good segue into actually looking at ideas around narcissism, because being kind of well-versed in the yoga/meditation culture, the word gets used fairly loosely to refer to anything or anyone that is kind of has a lot of self-regard or comes off with a lot of arrogance. And someone might actually, I'm just putting this out there, someone might read your book and say, well, isn't this ironic that this guy's so critical of mindfulness that, and criticizing it as being narcissistic, but how narcissistic of him to write a book like this, right? There's a kind of a popularized misunderstanding what narcissism is. So could you maybe walk me through the clinical definition or differentiation of narcissism and compare that to, say, sort of this popularized form of it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a condition called narcissistic personality disorder, and the defining features of it, I mean, if I had to choose one word for the defining feature of it, it would be entitlement. But as you know, there are a lot of things that go along with that too: arrogance, a sense of being entitled, even really despite earning any such entitlement. Those individuals with this condition tend to be exploitative of others, and so that's kind of one end of the continuum. You can kind of think of it as a spectrum, and at the severe end, you've got that condition, narcissistic personality disorder, and then as you go, down the spectrum or the continuum towards, milder and milder versions, you do get into more mundane expressions of selfishness. And, everyone's got some self-regard to them, no question about it. That's kind of human nature, really, is in a sense to have, a wish to be independent, autonomous, taking care of yourself and your own needs. That's only natural. There's a whole other strand, though, to human nature, and it has to do with our connections to one another and our responsibilities to each other, our duties, our obligations to one another. We're very social creatures, and without one another, a society like ours, in our case, a democracy like ours, can't work. And so, I think that both poles, the selfish part and the social connection part, both of those aspects of human nature are essential. And what I get concerned with, and a lot of what I wrote about in the book does have to do with getting pulled, our culture getting pulled way too much to one side, namely the one having to do with self-regard and the like.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything? What about narcissism itself, though, or what? I guess my question would be, what kinds of conditions give rise to it? If you take the initial myth of Narcissus, he falls in love with his own reflection. So there's a sort of a sense. Isn't there a sense of lacking, or a sense of insecurity, or lack of self-esteem that kind of fuels the development of narcissism?
Not always. I mean, that can occur, but that's not always the case. There's some thought that represents one very important subtype of narcissism, a sort of inadequate compensatory kind of idea, where you're really underneath, you're really lacking in self-esteem, and so you way overcompensate to come across as quite the opposite. And that probably does represent a solid chunk of people with these problems, but not all people with narcissistic problems have that. Some are just flat, arrogant, entitled, mm-hmm. without really any underlying self-esteem problems.
Well, the reason I'm bringing that up is because in my own loose observations of the culture around meditation and yoga is that you don't necessarily see in the majority, at least I don't see a majority of people having sort of huge, arrogant personalities. It's far more common that they're actually kind of somewhat broken characters, or people that are trying to heal, and they get into these practices, and then a kind of hyper self-focus, use the word solipsism comes in, and they're not even because it's coming in under the guise of trying to bolster a healthy sense of self-esteem. It kind of goes undetected.
Yeah, I see that point. I like that distinction between maybe say narcissism, self-esteem on the one hand, and then self-focus on the other hand. Because I think it's true that people can be, far from narcissistic and have a more or less, an average or normal sense of self-esteem, and yet be too self-focused. And I think that's quite possible. I do agree that that's probably maybe the more common scenario in those kinds of settings. It is self-focus that I also am protesting in the book. Because again, at least as I understand it, a lot of these practices and traditions, they really don't counsel that at all. They if anything, counsel the opposite. And yet, in the modern 21st century version, it seems often all about self-focus, and I think that's just wrong.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point about what maybe the original intent of these practices were about. My sense is that there has been some debate, in the various traditions. There's actually a very big split in Buddhism between sort of what are called the Theravada tradition, or very early sort of doctrinaire orthodox tradition, and then a revisionist tradition known as the Mahayana tradition. And in the Theravada tradition, the emphasis in practice really is about saving oneself first. It's about liberating oneself from suffering and getting off the wheel of life, in kind of a spiritual suicide mission of sorts. And then the Mahayana tradition, which you may know about, counsels the opposite, saying, defer your own enlightenment for the sake of liberating all beings first. So you focus on others as a course of practice rather than trying to just release yourself.
Well, interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. As I make, I think, very clear in the book, I am an outsider, and so a lot of these ideas, like what you were just describing, are new to me. Um, and so, I'm not as fluent as I should be with it. But one thought I had, and you're describing that, was in both cases there is still a sense of self abnegation. There isn't any sort of adulation of the self in either case. It didn't sound like to me, and yet in modern practices, it seems to me that a lot of self-adulation does come through. In fact, becomes the priority, and that's really what I'm railing against in this book.
Right. Well, before we look at your distinction between authentic mindfulness, false mindfulness, and the problems that come from that false form, maybe more broadly look at or consider for a second. Let's consider narcissism does seem to be on the rise, and there's some indicators that are supporting that. Do you see any particular explanatory factors for that in your view?
It's a hard one to answer. I mean, I am convinced that there is a rise, that's not just me, looking around at the media and at entertainment and et cetera, et cetera. That's pretty rigorous peer reviewed academic research, repeatedly showing that rise is real. So that part we have nailed down pretty well. The part though that you're asking about is harder to nail down, and it's why. And I don't have a great answer for that. I do think if you take a step back and look at history, there definitely are swings in this where it seems like selfishness, self-focus, self-regard, ebbs and flows over the course of centuries. And, we're definitely at it seems to me, a point where we're at a flow, where it's peaking. And that's the bad news, at least in my book. The good news is that it'll probably ebb, and it has in history before, and I hope that happens again. That's a little bit of an unsatisfying answer as to why this is occurring. My honest answer is I don't know, and I'm not convinced really that anyone does know for sure.
Right. I think in the back and forth over email as we set this meeting up, I was suggesting this comparison with the rise in obesity and diabetes around how in our evolutionary environment we were not exposed to access, or we didn't have access to sugar, a strong supply of sugar in our diet. But now in the modern environment, it's almost impossible to eat without ingesting sugar at some point, and this speaks to this blooming epidemic we see. And I'm just wondering if there was some other kind of new variable in the environment, which I link to kind of social media, the technology changes that just sort of stoked this sort of inherent trait in our human evolution that's now kind of mushrooming up.
Perhaps, and you'd certainly see plenty of self-focused, narcissistic kinds of things in social media. So perhaps it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, on the other hand, it is supposedly social media. It's not self-media, and there's supposed to be a social connection aspect to it. And I think in many ways, really, there is. And so I kind of view that as a mixed bag. Though I would have no doubt that it's part of the story.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's look at mindfulness itself then, because you do differentiate between what you call authentic mindfulness and false forms of mindfulness. In your mind, how do you define authentic mindfulness itself?
I mean, acknowledging that there's a fair number of diverse views on this, I tried to boil down the definition, at least as I saw it, to the following. It's the non-judgmental awareness, moment to moment, of, and here's where it gets important, everything. In other words, the general social, environmental, perceptual, everything environment that one can perceive, versus awareness of self. I suppose self is part of, this cosmos, this incredible universe that we live in, but to me it's an extremely uninteresting part of what is an incredible miracle of a cosmos. And to focus on this little point that happens to have to do with you or me or whomever, it just seems strange to do when there's so much else in the universe.
Right. And as you're saying that, I just wanted to echo that in the original sutta or teaching discourse that the Buddha gave on developing and establishing mindfulness, there's frequently this phrase to be mindful of things internally and externally. So this internal-external pair is always given of how to attend to one's experience, not to solely focus on internal arisings. The thing that I always have found kind of strange, and I know you pick up on it in your book, but is the injunction around non-judging, which I think is kind of a boomer addition from Jon Kabat-Zinn to this definition. Because if you look at, like as I said, the early Buddhist teachings, you don't really see that word be used. You do see an emphasis that's trying to develop a kind of discrimination and wisdom with regards to the causes of suffering for oneself and others, and the causes for the end of suffering in oneself and others. But there isn't this sort of I want to say feel good intention around non-judging. I know you talked about this in the book, but you kind of mentioned at one point that non-judging becomes kind of intellectually incoherent with some of the other ideals within the mindfulness movement.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, most of my criticisms in the book are reserved for distortions of mindfulness, fake mindfulness, so to speak. That's mostly what the book is about. But I think, even authentic, original mindfulness, you can criticize it too. And I think this is one of the points where you can criticize it. It does emphasize, at least to my understanding, being non-judgmental. And if you just take that idea and ponder it and then try to square it with human nature, which evolved to be extremely judgmental. We have a ton of mental equipment, neurological equipment that's just designed to be judgmental. Snap of the, finger, spur of the moment judgments. And to try to just say, okay, let's all of a sudden not be what we were designed over eons to be, that strikes me as questionable. And so that's questionable even with the authentic and genuine versions, and then you mix in all this selfishness, distort it even further, and it just gets to be a toxic brew in my view, or it can be. Not always, but it can become that.
Right, and along those lines, you talk about how I think you did a day-long mindfulness retreat yourself, and you report on how the teacher was emphasizing developing choicefulness.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? I remember.
Yeah, that was my understanding of it.
Yeah, so to be choiceful, but to not judge.
Yeah, and that struck me as also, debatable about whether that's possible. And I suppose it is, but it was hard for me to see. It seems to me more or less the same thing. But there's nuance there, and I think that was the point, is that there's nuance there, and I can kind of see that. And as for the retreat, I am completely a novice, and I do think it's important to at least try things that you're going to write about and critique. And so I did at least that, and it wasn't a bad experience at all. It was some of it was really good, but it was really clear to me the parts that I really thought were good and were valuable. All were things where we were being mindful. Not about ourselves, but about the environment, other people, the world, the universe. I thought that was great. There are moments there where I felt simultaneously relaxed and stimulated, and that's really something. And I see the value of that. Tellingly, though, that was only maybe 10% of the day. 90% of it was, the kind of things that, though I object to in the book, even those were not, noxious, in part because there was a real camaraderie there in that group. There were about 50 of us, and I think I was probably the only one, at least judging from kind of looking around and chatting, that was a skeptic. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, I was very much accepted, and I felt, a certain esprit de corps, and overall it was a positive thing. But it certainly did, bring to the front about, this distinction between focusing on yourself all the time versus what I would prefer to do, which is focus on everything else.
And you do make that note in the book that the mindfulness movement, with its emphasis on meditation and kind of stemming out of Jon Kabat-Zinn's work, has been internally focused more. And the other work of Ellen Langer, who I've had on the show, who really developed a kind of mindfulness that even preceded Jon Kabat-Zinn's work, which is much more outwardly focused, noticing novelty in your environment, your experience. That hasn't caught on in quite the same way, and that seems to be telling around the way that this has been absorbed by a culture prone to self-regard and narcissism.
I think that's exactly right. I didn't even know about Langer's mindfulness work really until I got a fair ways into the research for this book. And I think it's because this so to speak, selfish version has just drowned out other versions. But sure enough, once I was into the research and kind of followed some threads, I got to her work, and it's a lot more consistent with the way I was thinking about things. It's mindfulness. It's got a lot of that to it, but as you described, it's not about the self. It's about everything else, and to me, there's just real value in that, and that's more consistent to me that with the sort of original intent of many of these philosophies and practices and movements.
Right. You mentioned a few times that the main aim in your critique is against this false mindfulness. I have to say, as a reader, that wasn't necessarily my experience, though. I felt like in that first chapter where you took on authentic mindfulness, you gave that authentic form quite a drubbing in that chapter as well. And then in the chapters on false mindfulness, it felt like more of a larger critical cultural critique than it did actually the specifics of what this false mindfulness is. So I do want to come back to the false mindfulness, but I do also want to spend a little more time just talking about some of your observations around authentic mindfulness and the potential problems within it. One is, I would say that if you pick up the newspaper or catch these headlines, you'd think that science has just patently confirmed that mindfulness is the next best, greatest thing. That if you just do this, your health problems, your mental problems, all sorts of problems are going to be cleared. It's going to be a panacea for everything. And what I appreciated in your book was that you really go through rigorously on the side of the science and parse out where the science is good and indicative of benefit, and where the science is actually kind of falsely reporting what the research is showing. So I was hoping you could speak to that for some time.
Sure. I mean, it is oversold. That was kind of the point of that section of the book, is that, let's just stipulate that there is something there, and that it's at least somewhat beneficial for many people. The question is... And
just those key benefits would be, I think you mentioned greater positivity, maybe?
It can, yeah. I mean, any number of things that have been claimed for it in the mental health domains and in physical health domains too. Yeah, things like a more positive attitude, better mood, less anxiety, better focus, better concentration, really many things. And that's kind of the point, is that that part's been oversold in terms of how many different things that this is a balm for, supposedly. But not just that, the the power of the intervention, that's been oversold. And kind of my favorite way to illustrate this is to say that if something new that's come along, like this, like mindfulness as a treatment or what have you, it should do better in a rigorous and controlled way. It should outperform something as mundane as taking a walk every so often. I mean, if it's so special, it should do that. And yet, when you look at the mindfulness trials, actually, specifically the best ones, the ones that appear from the most credentialed people in the most vetted outlets, they just are not of that character. Yes, they can outperform very inert, control groups, but the minute you introduce a control like walking every now and then, the special power of mindfulness tends to disappear.
And let me pause you there, because that was something that really leapt out at me when I read your book, is that I had it's been years since I took any kind of research methodology course, but the point that you make around the necessity to have an active control in a research design is incredibly valuable if we're going to have meaningful results on the effects of, say, a mindfulness intervention versus what you just said is a passive control, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one thing for a treatment to outperform, no intervention, and that's needed. That's a step. That's one step. That it outperforms nothing. A real common form of nothing in these studies is what's called a waitlist control. So the active group, they're getting the actual treatment, and the control group, they're on the wait list to eventually get that treatment. But for now, they're not getting it. They're on the wait list. And so that's a good example of, a passive control versus an active control. I mean, never mind something like an antidepressant medicine. Even just something like take a walk every so often. That's not much of an active control, but it is an active control. And that's very revealing that when you introduce controls like that, the supposed special power of these interventions fade quickly.
So have there been, I wasn't clear, have there been studies where they compare mindfulness interventions against an active control like walking?
Precious few, very, very few, and those that do tend to produce null results. In other words, the very few studies that are like that, the tend to return results where the mindfulness group is no better and no worse, but no better than something like a group that walks every so often.
And in terms of your field of expertise around mental health, there is a lot of onboarding of mindfulness work in psychotherapy or psychological practice. Where do you come down on that? Do you feel, what's your interpretation of the research on that?
Unfortunately, it's not particularly impressive. I say unfortunately because we're at a stage in mental health promotion and in my specialty, suicide prevention, where we need to do a lot better. We need more treatments, we need more access, and we need more quality treatments, ones that work, rigorously shown to work. And so that's why I say unfortunately is that I welcome more, people or, so to speak, to this party, because we need more options, more effective options. But the research is just not supportive largely of the idea that mindfulness is some sort of special arrival to this party. I wish it were. We need that, but I also insist on being clear-eyed and not, overhyping things that may work a little bit, but certainly don't have the qualities of a miracle or anything like that. And I think some of that's happened with regard to this area.
Mm-hmm. So how do you differentiate the false mindfulness other than it just being more self-focused? Like how do you see it coming about, or what are its distinguishing features that you can define?
I think that's mainly it.
The
I mean, I think
self-regard?
once you introduce that sort of self-focus, I call it recursive in the book, or I use the term solipsism a lot. But it's that idea that being focused back on the self. Once you introduce that, to me, the cause is lost. I mean, that's just so contrary to what I understand the main gist of the original version to be, and the main value of the original to be, that once you introduce that, it is like introducing, a cuckoo's egg into a host's nest. You got a problem, and so it really does boil down to that.
Right. The thing that comes to my mind is that there's been for many, probably centuries now, there's been a thread of self-development, self-help, kind of call it a meme if you want, where there's the views such as, like, if you just think things correctly, think positively, you're going to attract things to yourself, that the universe is at your beck and call if you can just get the code of your mind aligned properly to think the right thoughts, or to exude the right energy, and then you'll draw things to yourself. In my mind, I feel like the mindfulness movement is a little bit vulnerable to that larger self-help culture, where people practice meditation, and even if the teacher is intending to say, treat all experiences evenly, whether it's arising internally or externally, treat it and just observe it neutrally, dispassionately, as you might say. There still is this idea. I hear this as a teacher. I hear people say, well, I had this thought and I really feel like this is my authentic truth and I need to go now do this. So they use this practice and then flip it into justification for sort of a very self-focused action.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. That's a problem, and yeah, I've seen it too. Yeah, because sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought there.
Well, no, it's because this is where I think it differentiates between just a sort of the idea of narcissism and the other condition of solipsism, which is a word that many listeners probably do know, but a lot of people don't know that term either. Do you want to take a whack at defining solipsism?
To me, it's just repeated self-regard. You're just kind of stuck in a loop, and the loop has to do with you, mm-hmm. and all about you. To me, that's what it involves. I lost my train of thought, but I've regained it. You're talking about taking care of oneself, and even prioritizing oneself. And I actually don't have a problem with that necessarily. It depends. I mean, why are you doing that? Why are you a priority? Why do you think it's important to take care of yourself? And if the answer to that is because I'm a special, unique, entitled, creature of the, that's just so important. If it's along those lines, I'm not interested. Versus if it's because I've got family to take care of, and I've got a responsibility to society, and I got a responsibility to community, and whatever form of community you like, church, how neighborhood, whatever it is. I'm very interested in that. So to me, self-care, taking care of yourself, prioritizing yourself, depends on why you're doing that. To me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you did take aim at self-care, self-compassion towards the end of the book, and I'm losing my train of thought here. But you sort of said you felt like we were stepping into an uncanny valley around it, where like the thought of encouraging or being encouraged to cultivate and develop self-compassion gave you the creepy heebie-jeebies.
It does me. I mean, and I think the not everybody, of course, has this mindset and won't understand, but to try to convey the idea or the feeling even to them, if you just if you ever been to a wax museum and you're just kind of gazing at a figure that just is so real, you're thinking it's about to move, and yet it's a wax figure. That feeling of eeriness or uncanniness, that's a good description of the uncanny valley, and it's created in me when I ponder these recursive, self-focusing loops that just turn back and back and back on the self. It gives me that same sense of that's just not right. That's eerie and strange and unnatural, and so at least to me that's how that feels. But I think that's only right because our natures are so social, and to totally disregard that part of our natures is, I think, to get things wrong.
Well, I have to share your sympathies there, because when I've been on my own meditation retreats, where I'm an attendee, whenever there's a session of guided meditation around what's called loving kindness, it usually starts with, say, 5-10 minutes of directing loving kindness towards oneself. And I also find it incredibly difficult and frustrating, and have gone so far as to actually skip those meditation sessions when I'm on retreat. But the argument goes that if you're going, like, and maybe you can dispatch with this argument, but the argument goes that if you're going to be able to love others, if you're going to be able to have compassion for others, you have to first have it for yourself. That's what the pop phrase says. How do you come down on that?
I'm not convinced. I mean, I don't think it follows. I don't see why. First of all, I don't have any problem with people being okay with themselves, liking themselves, even loving themselves. I suppose that's fine, but I don't see any logical connection between that and loving others. I think those are just not joined logically together, despite cultural assertions to the contrary. So I think, to me, they're just separate. They're just on separate dimensions. You can be however you feel about yourself, even if it's really bad. You can still be very caring, very loving, very essential to others. So to me, they're just separate dimensions. I'm just not convinced those two things are twinned like that.
Right. No, I'm glad. I'm happy to hear you say that, because there's also the even more bizarre phenomenon where someone's aware that they don't have self-compassion, but yet that they judge themselves and recursively beat themselves up for not being self-loving enough.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, that is maybe just my own observation, and I could be projecting here, but I tend to see this a lot. It's like they'll beat themselves up for not being self-loving enough in this kind of mindfulness sense.
Yeah, I can't say I ever thought of that or seen it, but it does fit into the more general argument of, if you get too far into your head and into these recursive self-looping things about I'm being compassionate or not too judge, or all about myself, it just is a road to perdition in my judgment. And the way out of it is just forget about all that. Forget about yourself, at least for a little bit, and focus on other people and on this incredible, miraculous universe that's all around.
And, around what you just said, focusing on the universe, the miraculous universe, I still find that the meditator being interested in one's own consciousness and the fact that one is conscious is every bit of a miracle as everything outside of the self, too. So to me, they're kind of on an equal playing field. But it occurred to me while reading your book, a phrase from the Zen master Dogen kept coming to mind, where Dogen famously said, the great way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be illuminated by the 10,000 things, or the myriad things. In a certain sense, by going into oneself deeply, the differentiation between self and other falls away, and there is this unification with all of existence in a certain way. It strikes me that potentially maybe the mindfulness movement is just really in its infancy, and that it hasn't outgrown that initial self-focus, and maybe possibly is getting fixated within that self-focus, which I think is where you come back in with the Challenger disaster, where is this where could this potentially launch us into disastrous territory, do you think?
I'm not a very political person, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I will talk about things like our, democracy and our republic. It does require selflessness. Always has, from the very founding. If you read the founding documents, they're incredible about how lacking in self-focus those guys were, and how social and selfless and responsible to each other they were. The founding documents, even the Declaration, which is about supposedly the modern era, it's about the independence of the self. No, it's really not. It's about the independence of the country. And so, if we lose that idea, that incredible sense or set of ideas, anything that detracts from that, to me, is going down the wrong path.
You actually bring this up in the book. I think you've been differentiating between individualism and individuality, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that the distinction? So just walk me through what the difference there is.
Yeah, I mean, one is the cult of the individual. That everybody's special. Everybody's should think they're special. Versus individualism, which the founding fathers, for example, would have been all for. That's the idea of, you're unique and autonomous, and you should see to your own needs. It's sort of like a rugged individualism, but implicit in it is the idea that, there's not anything really all that special about you. There's 7 billion others of you on this earth. We're very indebted and interconnected to one another. And so keep it in perspective, I guess, would be the implication of individualism, whereas individuality would be more of this cult of the special self.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. Given all that, do you have any ideas for solutions to the predicament that you're diagnosing?
Oh, I felt certainly, kind of compelled to at least try in one of the concluding chapters of the book. I started off by saying that, this has happened in the course of history. There are pendulum swings, so I don't think there's any quick fix. I do have some ideas, practical ideas in the back of the book, a couple of which have to do with the strand of philosophy having to do with stoicism, a very misunderstood set of ideas, because when most people hear Stoics, they think, oh, that person has no emotion, no joy, no pleasure, no passion, and that's not what the Stoics were about at all. In fact, what they were about, at least as I understand Stoicism, was two principles. One having to do with what you might call true control. Mm-hmm. In other words, you can control maybe what's in front of you, right in front of you here and now, but not what happened a year ago, not what's going to happen 10 years from now. So keep your focus on what you can control. It makes just a ton of practical sense. And then the other thing has to do with how ephemeral everything is, that it's all going to be gone. You can interpret that in sort of a melancholy way, but the Stoics turned it to the opposite. They said, because everything's going to be gone so soon, let's celebrate it. Let's enjoy it. Let's make the most of it in the moment. You put those two ideas within Stoicism together, and I think they start to reverse some of these trends we've been talking about on self-focus and the like.
How do you bridge the Stoic philosophy towards sort of cultural change? Like what could be like? So one question that came up for me was if you were to give advice to say someone that was practicing mindfulness or to someone that was teaching mindfulness, if you could tweak the kinds of mindfulness interventions that you've seen, I think I know what you're going to answer, but what might you do on that kind of practical level to start to shift the way it's going?
I mean, the main thought that occurs to me is, I mentioned the retreat that I did, and it was maybe 90% self-focused, 10% outwardly focused. An easy fix in my view would be to flip that, make it 90% about perceptual experiences, sensations, and the like that have nothing at all to do with the self. And then, sure, it's not realistic for the self part of it to be zero, but it doesn't have to be 90 either. It can be 10 or 15 or 20. Mm-hmm. Flipping it like that seems to me at least worth consideration.
Yeah, and just to tie back to with what you were referring to as authentic mindfulness, or at least what I think of authentic mindfulness from Buddhism, the things you just described about Stoicism are parallel, if not identical, to what's going on in early Buddhism, where there's an emphasis on, taking responsibility for what you can control, and also understanding the deep, impermanent nature of all conditions, or the ephemerality that you mentioned. So I do think there's a tie-in there, and in fact, the mindfulness practice is intended to essentially support one's ability to perceive those very things. Right.
I agree entirely, and that's one thing I kind of end up on the book is to say, if you get mindfulness right, you end up in the same spot as what the Stoics did, because what they're saying, is very compatible with at least what I view as genuine mindfulness, and what they're saying is totally contradictory to what I view as perverted mindfulness, having to do with the self and narcissism and such.
And it just occurred to me that one of the things that may be a contributory factor to the self-regarding form of mindfulness is the business that's pushing it now. And if you think about push like a sort of a marketing strategy, do you gain more customers by saying, by doing this, you're going to become more selfless? Or do you gain more customers by saying, come do this practice and have the year that you are destined to have?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I certainly accept that pitching selflessness, that's harder. I don't think it's impossible, but I accept that it's harder than pitching selflessness. I think that's true, and I think you can see it left and right in media campaigns, advertising campaigns. But I don't accept that it's impossible to do the selfless part. Maybe it just takes more creativity and more thought or more work.
Yeah, and more patience, I think, too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Too. Well, listen, Thomas, I want to thank you for your time. It's been great talking to you. And again, I just want to pitch your book. It's a great read. If anyone is a mindfulness teacher, mindfulness practitioner, you definitely want to be checking this out. Mindlessness, the corruption of mindfulness and the culture of narcissism. Do you have any other things online where people could find you?
I mean, nothing like a personal, kind of consistent with what we've been talking about. No, I don't have any self-focused web-based, presence. It's not hard to find me, though. I'm as you mentioned at the outset, professor of psychology at Florida State University, and this book and the others are, available in the usual places, not hard to find.
Okay. Well, great. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.